Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's Dark Reading webinar, The Rise of AI-Powered Malware and Application Security Best Practices, sponsored by OPSWAT and broadcast by Informa. I'm Michael Krieger with Dark Reading, and I'll be your moderator today. We have just a few announcements before we begin. First of all, this webinar is designed to be interactive. The dock of widgets at the bottom of your screen will allow you to learn about today's speakers, download resources, share this webinar via social media outlets, and participate in the Q&A session that takes place at the end of our presentation. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event. You may also download a copy of the slides via the resources widget. And toward the end of our webinar, we'll ask you to provide feedback via the survey widget found at the bottom of your screen. And please take a minute just to fill this out before leaving us today, because your feedback really helps us make these events better for you. And lastly, if you're experiencing any technical problems, just click on the Help widget found at the bottom of your screen, or type your issue into the Q&A area, and we'll be glad to offer one-on-one assistance. Now on to the presentation, The Rise of AI-Powered Malware and Application Security Best Practices. Discussing today's topic is Darren Spruill, Chief Intelligence Officer, Inquest, and George Prickich, who is the Vice President of Products at OPSWAT. If you want to learn more about our speakers, you can find their bios in the Speaker Bio widget on your screen. And again, if you want to ask our speakers any questions, please use the Q&A area that's also to the right of your screen. And George, thanks. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. We have quite a few things we'd like to share with you, so I'll jump right into it. So real quick, when we're looking at the agenda, we want to split it into different topics. One is, what are the AI risks, what we've seen from our customers, not just from the industry, but also discussing with our customers, but also like what are some of the best practices we end up talking with our customers on some of their challenges. So when we're going through like AI security risks, there are a couple of things that I want to mention, right? This is not new. It's been, OWASP released a top 10 for LLMs quite a few months ago. There's a lot of materials out there. There's a lot of content on like how you can actually prevent malicious attacks and so on, or how you can use the LLMs to build new malware and so on. But a couple of things I want to mention, we're not going to delve into OWASP top 10 too much, but there are quite a few things here that focus specifically on the LLMs and what are the risks associated with that. Now, one thing I want to mention is that actually one of my favorite papers actually is the Databricks AI Security Framework. I highly recommend you if you haven't reviewed this one. It's a pretty long document, but at the same time, it provides a very comprehensive structure on how they looked at these risks, not just part of like using the LLM, but also from the beginning of like training. What are all the steps? What are the risks associated with each of those steps? What are the feature sets, or like what are the expectations in each of those steps and the risks associated with that, and so on and so forth. And once they get all those risks, they put it together, negated like 55 risks identified. Then they figure out what are the best security controls they can put in practice to address those risks and how you can leverage it as part of your own platform. So I highly recommend checking out this paper. Again, it's a bit long, but at the same time provides a very good description of the risks that are identified when it comes to using AI, not just LLMs, as part of your applications. Now, one thing, and this is a paper actually from a best practice document from AWS. One thing I really like about this one is not just about, it has a more holistic view. It's not just about the AI or LLM itself. At the end of the day, you're building an application on top of that LLM. Right? You're still having the exact same functionality you had in the past exposed to an end user, but it's in a more user-friendly way, if you want, right? Instead of like clicking a button to get a result, you can ask more diverse questions instead of having them hard-coded, so to speak, right? And I think this is a good and a bad. It's definitely way better when it comes to user experience, but it's also more complex and more challenging when it comes to actually securing that one from a security team perspective, right? Because you might end up training the LLM or giving the LLM access to different information. Some of them might be confidential. You don't know exactly what the questions going to be on the other end, right? And there are a lot of attacks. And again, we can go back to OWASP top 10 and discuss more on that one, or even on the Databricks paper, where like there are model extractions, even training data that can be exfiltrated from the models and so on, right? By crafting your prompt in such a manner to get more insights out of it. right? So then it becomes a little more challenging when you're looking at securing these applications, right? Again, this would be still a web application, let's say. You're still going to put a WAF in front of it, right? There's a lot more you can build from best practice when it comes to application security. But in the past, you had a strict contract between your application and the database or your data source, so to speak, right? You know exactly what queries you're running. Those were audible. You know exactly what is built. I know there are different peer reviews and so on for you to be able to accept that you want to expose that information to the audience, right? RBAC controls and so on to know exactly who gets access to what information and so on. But now it's a lot more complicated than that, right? Because you're training that LLM, you're not going to have an LLM for each of your own user. You're not going to have a chatbot for each of your roles and so on and so forth. So it's going to be harder to restrict that access, but at the same time, you can put a lot more validations on the output, and that's where things get even more complicated and so on. So this is the part that for me is a blessing in disguise, right? You improved a lot the user experience, that users can actually phrase their questions in the way they are looking for, but at the same time, the more access you give to the data, the better the response is going to be, but also the more exposed you are, right? And that's why it's a very complex problem, and that's why you need to understand a bit better what exactly is the goal for this one and to try to break things apart a bit better, right? And then again, it's a matter of like what exactly you're providing. And when it comes to securing your data, this can be, again, part of your training or even part of your production with RAG and so on. And we can discuss that a bit in a few slides. But for me, it's very important to understand that, again, you still have an application that you're building, right? LLM is just an engine, right? To a certain level, even though it's not necessarily the case, you can think about it, you're replacing your database RM, your queries to your database with a more complex system that's taking care of that for you to collect the data, right? And this can actually mean that you simplify your life a lot more. You don't need to go through a business analyst to put a report for it together in a week. You can actually ask the question you want to hear the answer for, and that might actually come back in minutes, hours, whatever that might be. And if we go next, there's also another thing that's very interesting to us that wasn't that much covered is the malware problem, right? And I think this is something that we definitely see a lot more from our customers. And this is the kind of conversations we had. And that's why I want to focus a bit more discussion on this part of the story as well, because there was a huge push for adopting AI and LLM, even though they're not necessarily synonyms, they're used that way, right? But there was a huge push of adopting as much as possible AI as part of automating workflows in an organization, using chatbots and so on to like optimize the customer experience and so on and so forth, right? Building copilots and so on in each product. But at the same time, everyone is going to more or less to Hugging Face to get access to more newer models, to get access to data sets for training and so on. The way I like to see Hugging Face is the GitHub of AI and machine learning, right? You find a lot of resources there. You have a huge repository. But at the same time, a lot of this adoption is driven also, again, it's a business decision to push in that direction. Everyone wants to optimize. Everyone wants to provide a better experience. But at the same time, security is almost an afterthought in this example, right? Because you can go there, you can download whatever data set you want, but that doesn't mean those data sets were in the past validated. Right now, actually, Hugging Face added the functionality to scan the files that are being uploaded them using ClaimAV. Again, as security practitioners, we all know that ClaimAV as an open source is not providing the best detection possible, but at the end of the day, we are at least seeing some progress in that direction. But the exact same thing again with GitHub. So many malicious libraries are on GitHub. You need to expect the same. Like these are services that provide a repository for you to upload the files that you want to share with the community. That doesn't necessarily mean it's not a malicious file and so on. Maybe people are going to start uploading malware detection models with the data sets they're using for trainings to Hugging Face, right? That more or less is a legit case. I mean, you have GitHub repos that are filled with malware samples. Why would not be the case here, right? And I love this research that was done by JFrog. They found over 100 different malware samples. Most of them were focused on PyTorch, right? And this is something that shows you that threat actors are looking to exploit the rush in adopting AI and try to push actually to like get in these organizations by leveraging these supply chain attacks. And it's incredibly easy to do that, right? And I think this is the part that this slide for me is actually shocking, right? It's so easy to be able to upload something that you get arbitrary code execution on the end user's machine, right? I upload the model that's using that pickle files. For people that are not familiar with pickle, is just a binary serialization method from Python. But the moment you load that one, it automatically loads it and runs it on your machine, right? So I can put whatever code I want there. And it doesn't have to be ransomware. It can be a reverse shell quite easily, right? And I get access to that machine, and then I can, either exfiltrate data, their own IP, or lateral movements and so on, right? And this is something, again, it's not novel. This is something that's been there for a while. You can see that Python was actually put down last year. They suspended submissions to Python last year, and again this year, like a couple of months ago, because threat actors kept uploading malicious packages to it. User new libraries, but also user creation was suspended just because people were using it to distribute malicious packages. And one of the things to mention there, it's like for the one that was actually this year, PyTorch was one of the 8 libraries used as part of the typo squatting attack. Meaning, instead of having, if someone is searching for PyTorch, but they're not able to or they're misspelling it, there's a typo there, they will serve a different library and give the impression that it's PyTorch, right? And there were a lot of things in the past, even when you're looking at even GitHub, they had some things where they more or less you could fake also the number of stars and so on, the reputation of that repository. They're closed a bit better, that environment now, but that will give you a better sense that, oh, this is a trusted library, a lot of people are using it, I'm gonna go and use this as well. Same thing on PyPy as well, right? And one thing I added here, even though it's not necessarily connected to PyPy or Pickle, but it's still connected to PyTorch, it's a paper, it's a blog from, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to mispronounce his name, so apologies in advance, John, but John Stawinski. I love that blog post, right? So from actually looking at GitHub runners, he was able to get keys to be able to more or less release its own PyTorch version, for him to change artifacts, for him to actually release new versions of PyTorch, modify the code, and so on and so forth, even getting access to AWS keys and so on, right? It's been, I don't think it took him a lot of time, but at the same time, it's been a bit of investment on his side. But that for me shows you how dangerous this kind of supply chain attacks could be. Because we're trusting these systems to take care of the security for us. And some of these things, they haven't even thought that they might be leveraged in that way. And again, I highly recommend for you guys to check that blog. If any of you are the Black Hat, he's going to have actually a talk on that one. But again, that showed you how well or not some things might actually be protected, and it's your data at risk, right? Because the moment you have access to AWS keys, I can go and access your S3 buckets as well. I have access to your GitHub tokens. I can go and publish malicious code on your behalf to a library that's being used by millions of people, and so on and so forth. And one quick thing that I mentioned in the past was how we actually secure the prompt and the RAG, right? For some of you not familiar with the term of RAG, it's more or less retrieval-augmented generation, which means instead of actually training your models on certain data, you can provide some additional context at runtime for them to go and retrieve additional details and augment that prompt before it actually generates the data, right? So you not necessarily need to you don't necessarily need to train everything on the latest data possible. You can give it access to a certain, being structured, unstructured data, being, a database dump, or being, some PDF files, some papers you want them to research, some, marketing assets for them to generate a new keynote presentation, and so on and so forth, right? And the way that works is, again, you have access to those files, you give it access, that more or less you need to parse the content from there, chunking the data, and then make it available through the prompt as part of the query, right? So and that all happens behind the scene, but it's still access to files. It's still access to private data, right? And then on the prompt side, more models or more chatbots nowadays allow you to also upload the file, right? I can upload in my discussion with my bank, or part of my, maybe I'm gonna have an expense report. I can upload, here's the invoice, I'm entitled to $1,000 or something like that expense, right? I can show the evidence and so on, and then there is a part that's gonna more or less extract that content, push it through the LLM, do some validation, and then spit out the result, right? And this is another part that, again, some files that might be sensitive might be sent out to a chatbot. Should we allow that or not? So it's a DLP question. But also as an application, as an enterprise organization that exposes that chatbot or that functionality, what files are you accepting as part of your flow, right? How can you ensure that file is not doesn't have a malicious intent? And when I say malicious intent, doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be a malicious file. Yes, we should also still check, as again, the same principles of application security, web application security should apply on a regular application or if it's using in the backend an LLM, right? Just because you extract the content from it doesn't mean that you don't have to check for malicious content. But malicious intent can be more than that, right? I can fool the LLM and saying that, hey, my document is $1,000, but I add 3 extra zeros that like white font and white background, right? So when the content is extracted, it's not going to look at the formatting of that one. It's just going to extract content. It's going to look like I'm entitled for like $1 million and so on, right? There needs to be a lot more validation in the backend. I'm pretty sure no one will allow to issue a refund of $1 million without doing a proper validation. I really hope that's never been the case, but that shows malicious intent. I'm trying to fake the data, right? And we're going to talk a bit more on that one as well, but those kind of adversarial attacks that we need to prevent, right? And it doesn't have to be just font color. It can be, again, text behind an image, right? For us, it's like, okay, this invoice looks okay, but there is content that is hidden that's actually masked, and the LLM will read that one and might follow some malicious instructions based on that, right? So it's not just about like properly sanitizing the input, identifying if there's malicious intent as part of that input, but also checking the output to make sure that nothing that is not supposed to go out from data leakage perspective or accepting some, again, of these documents might actually lead to like a, I don't know, an outbreak or something like they're gonna release more data than they're supposed to. When I say they, I mean the LLM. And with that, I'll pass it to Darren to talk a bit more on like how AI malware is being, AI-based malware is being used.
Yeah, thanks. There's a lot of facets when it comes to AI-based threats, and obviously, sort of in the traditional malware space, we are seeing developments there as well. This is something that's been occurring over the last year or so, as a lot of researchers are very interested in basically applying AI technology to development of malware. One of the concepts that we see sort of materializing here has been discussed by a couple of researchers, including CyberArk in 2023, and then more recently, HIAS, putting out a proof of concept malware family that they refer to as BlackMamba, which is, in a sense, AI generated. We would probably call it like AI augmented. The concept of this tool is effectively, resulting in AI enabled polymorphism. And polymorphism, of course, is a trait that you see with some malware families where code can be automatically generated and in each additional serial instance, effectively, polymorphic. So different opcodes are used to achieve the same ultimate payload. And this, of course, makes, detection considerably more difficult. Instead of like static bytes, what you're looking at is dynamic bytes or even like new routines that are utilized and cycled in. So this proof of concept Trojan is interesting in the concept of how it uses the OpenAI API for basically generating the malicious payload, which is then executed in an embedded Python API. And so the exec function receives a payload that was generated by OpenAI using a prompt similar to what you see there to come up with the malicious payload. The payload that they're going for is a keylogger. And so there are a few different ways in Windows, of course, that you can use keystroke logging, different APIs that are used for that, and different ways of sort of like structuring that if you think about sort of morphing the functions that are utilized for that to generate those routines. So once that's received back from the OpenAI API, then that's effectively dynamically executed in memory using Python's exec function. And that bytecode, of course, is polymorphic in that sense. Another interesting feature that they added to this, just to illustrate, how like an advanced attacker might sort of exfiltrate captured keystroke data, was exfiltration via Microsoft Teams. So we'll be using a cloud service there rather than something like a attacker-operated C2 server or drop zone with that, for example. So we do kind of take this as, educational. The concepts themselves fundamentally are not terribly different. This is sort of, I think, indicative of maybe the phase that we're in as we're researching AI. The TTPs themselves are not necessarily new. We're talking about keystroke logging exfiltration to cloud security. And then, of course, the concept of malware polymorphism isn't net new also. We've been dealing with polymorphic malware for a long time, and we do have detection capabilities which can focus in on other areas which are not necessarily polymorphic, but then also looking at like the routines that generate or sort of govern the polymorphic aspects within the binary itself. But it does show us that there is a lot of, I think, focus area here in the research community, and this is something that I think will surely evolve over time, especially as threat actors, find ways to kind of take these principles. We do notice underground actors borrowing from security research, and so that's one of the things that we sort of struggle with, I think, is how to achieve that balance of informing the public while not also effectively sponsoring malicious actors. So that balance is interesting for us. Moving into other AI-focused risks in this area, cybercrime, of course, is easily enabled when we talk about this. The use of LLMs today, they're aiding attackers in generating malicious content, I would say probably more accurately and also more quickly. So generative AI, we find that leveraged quite a bit for effective phishing campaigns. We talk about phishing in terms of like financially motivated credential phishing, which is just sort of like never going away and has been here for a very long time. So this is a new way of effectively like augmenting that capability with AI. If you're a native speaker, this doesn't really necessarily change the game much for you. An English speaker, English-speaking threat actor targeting English-speaking populations has never really ran into this. But if you're like a foreign-speaking adversary, you see this as like a significant advantage. The ability that you can now avoid typos and generate more realistic, professional-sounding content without having to like struggle going through different tools and refining it and coming up with like a better lure effectively. And so the main advantage here is we find that generative AI is very useful for adversaries who want to impersonate like the tone and then appear quote unquote on brand, right? If they're targeting a specific brand in terms of like a banking institution or something like that, there's already enough content that they can draw from that can help them sort of like strike a tone that to a lot of users may appear, natural and sort of legitimate. So the illustrations here on this page, these come from a tool called GLTR. And this is a research tool which is effectively around trying to identify or score particular text inputs to determine, how much of that content likely came from a generative AI LLM model. Anything that's green is going to be like a top predicted word for that period or for that place within the payload. Anything that's like yellow or red is going to be sort of unexpected. So when we look at these blocks of text, we see blocks of text that are largely green, largely follow sort of like the template that you might expect from a generative AI engine. And thus we see that like this was, highly likely generated using an AI tool such as OpenAI. So this sort of thing kind of goes to illustrate, I think, how effective, the phishing payloads can be and the ease with which they can be utilized. Moving on to a similar sort of angle here, when we talk about phishing and we talk about the concept of disinformation, or what is typically referred to in like government circles as information operations, IO, they have very similar sort of like focus areas, right? The attempt here is to mislead somebody to take action or to influence them to do something or to believe a certain way. So in the disinformation space, we find that a couple of outlets are typically using this quite a bit today. We've seen both pro-China and pro-Russia threat groups leveraging artificial intelligence to basically expand their information operations and also crank up the amount or like the volume of what they're putting out. This corresponds, of course, very neatly with going into like an election cycle here in the US and then also some recent election cycles in other Western nations. And so we're finding that AI is taking part in political influence campaigns heavily today. Foreign adversaries look to this to sway opinions, sow discord, and attack democratic processes. So whereas the financial aspects of phishing are one thing, this tends to take on geopolitical and sort of geostrategic aspects to it. There's a lot of AI-driven tools that are developing and maturing today and can be abused for this. And one thing that we know as we sort of like analyze, I think, this space is that one of the threats that you sort of face in terms of using AI day to day, which ends up being like the hallucination issue, making sure that you're generating believable, accurate content. That doesn't really factor in when we're talking about, disinformation. Fundamentally, disinformation doesn't need to be accurate. And so something that is produced, that is like a fallacy from a hallucination can actually, be used to additionally like sow chaos and discord into the process. And so this is like a stumbling block that just doesn't really exist in this space. So this is one thing that we're definitely going to be keeping our eyes on, and one thing that I know a lot of organizations that sort of work in this space are focusing on as well. Moving on to a fundamental concept for something that's developed heavily within the cybercrime space. And this really I think, started emerging in like early to mid 2023. And this is the concept of, black hat LLMs, or what we refer to as like unrestricted LLMs. As OpenAI became popularized and saw a lot of use, there was a tremendous amount of focus put into a lot of the topics that George has talked about, sort of putting those guardrails in place, making sure that we have control over the prompt, and making sure that like what the user is requesting sort of fits, maybe call it like the ethical and moral and also policy-driven aspects of what we generate from that LLM. However, in the underground, there's a real craving from users to have an unrestricted access to these models so that they can request, criminal intent with what they're effectively putting into the prompt. So there was an explosion of interest in basically publishing LLMs for AI that enabled cyber criminals to carry out fraud. A lot of the things we talked about before, like phishing and things like that, generating malicious payload. Some of what we saw emerge, names of those projects were EvilGPT, FraudGPT, WolfGPT, WormGPT, and XXXGPT. One thing that we noticed when analyzing these is some did have a more significant lifetime, and they did apparently have a number of users who were utilizing them, as seen in like a discussion on Telegram chats and underground forums. But several of these materialized and were effectively the vaporware. Anytime we deal with like cyber criminal actors in the underground, there's also a high rate of sort of no honor among thieves, we would call it, and effectively sort of, fraudsters defrauding other fraudsters. So some of these came up to effectively try to get initial investment from people and access to them, and never really appeared to materialize into significant projects. So this follows a very similar trajectory to other things where a significant interest in a particular topic leads to the release of tools in the underground that don't necessarily materialize and mature into projects that are impactful. A number of them are, however, so we tend to keep an eye on these. And I think it seems going forward that as developments in models are released, we'll continue to see these sorts of unrestricted LLMs also try to mirror those and expose those capabilities to other cyber criminals. So pivoting real quick to a couple of best practices in context of these. One thing that we notice as defenders is so many of the threats that follow on AI, from the augmentation or the enabling factor that they tend to introduce, still ends up resulting in file-based tradecraft. So at OPSWA and at EnQuest, one of the things that we really focus on is the file-based threat or file-borne threats. And effectively, that's a way of saying that we shift the focus and look at the threat landscape through a lens largely of files. Malicious files are utilized through all layers of the kill chain and through the attack framework. And we find the fundamental concepts and defenses can still be largely effective. So social engineering is a pretext to enable users to take an action. That action that's normally followed when you're talking about phishing attacks or malware-based threats normally evidences itself as like a file or a stage of files, kind of like a chain of file stages. So AI attacks are typically still facilitated using file-based tradecraft, whether it's the malicious files that appear in repositories, like George talked to, or the payloads that we see in malware families, like I mentioned. And if we kind of take a look at phishing, AI augmented phishing is still fundamentally phishing. It's just sort of like more elegant to increase the social engineering effectiveness. So this focus on files for us still does give us as defenders a way of really being able to combat the threats that we face with a file-based defense focus, which means scanning those files and really breaking them down to identify the components within them that are kind of tied to like attacker TTPs and techniques that they utilize. Different attackers have different sort of capability levels. That's the table that we're presenting here, going from a range of like less skilled hackers for hire, who really tend to be the most excited at this stage with their opportunistic attacks, leveraging AI, through to like highly capable, targeted, state threat actors who are still using a lot of like very fundamental and effective file-based tradecraft with a high degree of evasion and probably less focus on AI. However, they're going to have the resources, most likely, for developing advanced AI sort of capabilities and figuring out ways to integrate those into their attack life cycles and also develop the LLM-driven approaches that are effective here. And let's see, pivoting back, George. Nope, still me. Security awareness. So the last touch on this. Refocusing security awareness is probably something that we're overdue for. If we kind of take a look at the way that we've taught, I think, our users over the years to recognize phishing attacks, we've sort of focused on like extremely obvious sort of things and things that AI has now rendered somewhat ineffective. So for example, I might have advised users, 10, 15 years ago to look for things like typos and misspellings in a phishing message, or look for something that just sounds like it's very off and maybe wasn't authored by like a native user writing to their language, for example. The intent there was to identify that if you're like an English speaking victim and you're targeted by somebody out of Eastern Europe, you might look for like lexicographical, grammatical, spelling errors, things like that, and then really surface that. AI today is going to make a lot of that advice sort of deprecated. And so refocusing security awareness has to give into basically educating our users on how to harden themselves and their systems against broad classes of attacks. So for example, I don't need to necessarily teach you how to recognize a phishing message, but it is helpful for me to focus on teaching you that the embedded link in a phishing message can be malicious. And if you notice something where a bank is asking you to go to their website to log in, but the link that they're taking you to is actually not the bank's website, that's going to survive non-AI as well as AI-based attacks. Also, if I teach you that MFA is important and all of your important accounts should have MFA on them, that's something that can also withstand both, traditional as well as AI augmented attacks. And so security awareness and phishing training, so on and so forth, I think we're going to see that really has to evolve. And we have to basically focus on educating our users for the things that AI does not necessarily touch on that are going to be there regardless whether AI is used or not. And a lot of that can really help our users, I think, be better able to defend against this. All right, George, back to you.
Thank you, Darren. And now a little bit shifting focus to actually building or using this part of your applications as well, not part of your defense, or like let's say, defend against the malware. But when it comes to actually building your application, again, it's the same story, right? You're building an application, you need to secure your pipeline. You need to secure the way your CI/CD pipeline, you need to secure the way you're building your application. These were some of the best practices you had in the past. The exact same thing applies now. The moment you allow your developers or engineers to download models or even data sets from Hugging Face, it needs to go through a scrutiny process, right? It needs to go through an approval process if you want, right? Not anyone should be able to download everything they want from the internet and run their local machines and expect things to go well. And for that, again, we highly recommend looking at each of the steps. And we had the diagram that from Databricks, for instance, same thing as part of your development lifecycle. There are different steps. Look at each of those steps and try to impose or add an additional file security layer, right? The fact it's source code, it's containers, or it's models, open source libraries, it's almost the same thing. You need to apply the same zero trust, even though I hate buzzwords, kind of concept to these files as well. Right, so it's not just about like, hey, is this file being malicious, but also the sensitivity of that file. What exactly is in that file, right? We see even now, after all this time, we still see in the media that there were attacks that were based on like kind of getting credentials from public Docker repositories and so on, from Docker Hub and so on, right? There was a very, I don't know, like a big one a few weeks back with PyPy that actually someone was able to like retrieve the keys for it and so on. So those are kind of problems that we need to have part of your CI/CD pipeline validation. And in this one also, again, it's an engineering process as well that needs to be followed for developing applications using LLMs and building your own AI models and so on. Now, when we're talking about content in general, and I'm mentioning it as a content, not just files, right? Because at the end, they can be anything that's being passed, right? It doesn't have to be per se a file, but at the end of the day, we need to look into like, hey, if we have data at rest, and those most probably are going to be files, right? What do you do with those ones? Are you scanning them? Are you accepting them from the outside, not just internal-based documents? Even if it's just internal, maybe one of the devices was compromised and something was uploaded in that repository that wasn't supposed to be there, right? And then like, how do you handle the PII, part of your discovery, right? There are a lot of documents and documentation out there on like data lineage, provenance, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go through all that, but at the end of the day, it needs to be clear on like what exactly you're using to allow these AI models, these LLMs, and so on to actually access, right? And if you give them access to all the PII data, again, don't be surprised if someone's able to exfiltrate that data, that training data afterwards, right? So it needs to be more clean. So maybe tokenization, even that one is not enough. Maybe you need to have even redaction part of your flow, either for, again, part of your training or part of your production environment as well. Right, and the same again, that's what I'm trying to say there with the user content being used as part of the RAG, not just for the training. Right, and the moment the end user is uploading files in, right, like what exactly are you allowing end users to upload to you? If you're just allowed to have like, I don't know, JPEG and PDF, fine, but even those ones can carry things that are not supposed to be there, right? I'm not talking just metadata, but might be, I don't know, JavaScript in a PDF, right? There might be things that they're gonna try to leverage in time. Almost everybody's trying to use Python, like I said in the past, for their machine learning story. Probably they're using like a PDF for parsing the content in a PDF. That will make it a very high target for threat actors to try to find a vulnerability in that one to be able to infiltrate, right? So those kind of things you need to ask how exposed you might be accepting these files, what are the file types you're going to support, how you're going to manage those ones, and how you can also manage malicious intent, right? The example I gave previously with white font and white background, text behind images, and so on and so forth. It doesn't have to be just the fact that it has a malicious JavaScript in the PDF or some embedded object and so on, right? And then it's also a story on like what you allow on data out, right? Like if people are consuming part of your adoption of these solutions, then maybe you have an enterprise agreement with OpenAI, or you have something built in-house, or you have a different vendor, right? What exactly are your employees allowed to send to this LLM, right? Are they allowed to send sensitive information? Definitely it's easier for me to, I don't know, integrate OpenAI to read all my emails. I get hundreds of them a day. I don't have time to read them all, but is that a good practice? Do I want OpenAI to summarize it just to make my life easier? What happens with the confidential information there as well, right? So those kind of things that, again, there is a lot of optimization, like process optimization. There's a lot of efficiencies you can gain, but it needs to also, security needs to step in and make sure that we're not ending up giving the keys to the kingdom just to make people's life easier, right? So there needs to be some process in place. We all want to build as many efficiencies as possible. We want to speed up the any kind of process, but at the same time, we need to understand a bit better, like what is the exposure, what is the risk associated with these ones. Now, what we are suggesting and what we've worked for years actually, and like how our customers are using it, is our file security MyDefender platform, right? And this is something we've put together for different use cases. And we have a lot of different variations based on technologies and how they fit. For instance, on this diagram, we highlight 4 of the technologies: the Metascan, which is a multi-scan technology; the Adaptive Sandbox, generation-based technology; deepcdr, that's sanitizing content in productivity documents, like I said, like removing the JavaScript from a PDF, macros from Office Suite, and so on and so forth. Also proactive DLP when it comes to identifying PII, PHI, watermarking redaction if needed, and so on and so forth. And all that is available to run in your environment or in our SaaS as well, and you can consume it in different ways. And the entire idea for what we're building is pretty much hooking into your existing workflows, right? The bread and butter of our technology is to offer the best potential technologies to solve your problem, but also to offer the ease of integration to hook into like what you already have a process, instead of asking your engineers or asking your product teams or asking any of the existing applications to change the way they're doing things and re-architect everything to be able to add security to it, right? And that means that we can, again, hook into an S3 bucket, we can hook into like a GitHub repo or like Artifactory and so on and so forth, depending on the needs. And real quick, just to cover a couple of the technologies, because I want to give a couple of minutes towards the end to answer some of the questions. I keep seeing that you guys are popping questions there, so please go ahead, keep doing that. On multi-scanning, we offer over 30 anti-malware vendors as part of our platform. We have, we're trying to add more, so if you have any of the vendors that you're using and you want to see it as well, like we're happy to discuss that one as well. But the entire idea is that we're trying to build the best detection capabilities possible. And one of the things that's very important, I don't think it's very clear for everybody, is that there's a big difference between what is running on an endpoint that's monitoring that machine. You can see that I'm opening this file is trying to run JavaScript and access PowerShell and dump a file and so on and so forth, versus you have 50 milliseconds, tell me if this file is good or bad, right? So it's a very different expectation, and the more you are crowdsourcing that intelligence, those detection capabilities, the better detection we get, but it's still not going to be a perfect 100%, right? So the next investment we've made was in our technology called deepcdr, which stands for Content Disarm and Reconstruction. So in a nutshell, what it does, it takes any productivity file, and we support over 150 file types, and it's breaking out to different components, and we're able to extract certain components out of it, and this is a policy you can define on your own, on like which objects should be kept or not as part of the regeneration of that file, right? So maybe in general, we don't touch the content, all we touch is the structure of the file. So if you have like macros and you don't want to keep macros, they're out, right? If you want to keep images, we're gonna regenerate the images on their own as well, because they might actually have like steganography, things in metadata and so on and so forth, right? Even OCR the images to make sure that we don't have like data leakage as part of that one. So that's kind of like the behavior where we're taking that file, we're looking at the structure, then we regenerate a new file only with the content that is safe to consume. So you're always going to have a safe to consume copy on the other end, regardless of what was the risk associated with that JavaScript or macro and so on and so forth. And there are certain things there that, like I said, we don't touch the content. There are two exceptions. One is the hyperlinks, where we have the ability to rewrite hyperlinks if you want to go through like a safe redirect functionality, but also QR codes where, again, it's hyperlinks behind the scene, but there's no way for it to validate it's a malicious or not hyperlink, or where is it actually going to the bank website, as Darren mentioned previously, or it's a phishing link. And again, this is pretty much what I explained, where we're looking at the file structure and we're keeping only the components that make sense. Again, everything is configurable on what's your risk appetite, let's put it this way. But at the end of the day, we're trying to clean up as much as possible from the file and always provide like a safe to consume copy. On the proactive DLP, it's the same thing we mentioned in some of the other slides as well. It's important not just to detect this information, but also to provide an enforcement, right? And especially on data out, it's so important that, again, the more you're allowing people to send files out, the more sensitive information might actually go out, right? And this is something that you want to boost their productivity. You want to give them access to these tools, right? So maybe it's part of your CASB or web gateway proxy and so on story. But if it's not, this can actually be maybe even outside of your network and so on, that can still happen, and you want to make some enforcement. So it's not just discovery of the PII, but it's also enforcement on what happens once you discover those violations, let's call them, right? And for this one, we can do a lot more than just, hey, we want to discover what's the PII there. We can actually identify, even not safe for work content, we can actually build more of a template version, let's say, if you need to actually have something like we only allow this kind of format or like this kind of forms upload, these insurance forms are the only things I'm going to upload, I'm going to allow in my file upload capabilities, therefore we can restrict some access based on that and so on. Two quick case studies. We have Zoom as a very happy customer is using as part of their release assurance security team. More or less all the builds that are actually generated or like kind of build on weekly, even nightly builds from are being scanned and so on. But whatever is released to the public, it's actually going through our scanning process. There are two things to consider if you're actually on the technology side of things. It's important for you to detect if there's anything malicious in your binary, no question about it. Last thing you want is to ship something out that has a crypto miner or something in it. But at the same time, it's also important to identify if there's any false positive that's going to be generated a part of your new binary, right? So in case one of the anti-malware vendors are flagging you as a malicious application, that will create a lot of bad press for you, a lot of reputation problems as well. So you need to look into that as well. We've been, again, if you want, you can read the full story on our website on how Zoom is leveraging our solution. Same thing with Hitachi Energy. There's a great story, great partnership we have with them as well. And they're using this one to scan all their builds as well before they're shipping to their customers. And they have like different ways to leveraging the platform, being from on-prem to isolated environments to our cloud and so on and so forth. So as a quick wrap up, we have this Mad Defender platform. What's the say that like if your hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So we're working strictly at files and we're looking at like all the potential file inputs in the company, data entry points, if you want to call it that way, right? And based on that, we're actually trying to filter as much as that. We want to be the gatekeepers, if you want, for any file coming in and going out, right? So that can be from like email, storage, being from S3 buckets or not, to peripheral media, and so on and so forth. So as examples, we have, I know, 8 out of top 10 banks using us for file upload, out of 8 out of top 10 banks in US using us for their file upload story to validate the files that are being accepted in part of their application are not malicious. We have almost all nuclear facilities in US using us to scan the USBs as you're walking through the air-gapped environment to scan, to update some firmware and so on, right? So we have a lot of great stories that we build around the Mad Defender platform, right? What we're trying to achieve is to provide the best detection possible, the best prevention capabilities, and also full analysis over the files, meaning not just, hey, it's good or bad, but also what's the risk associated with that one? What are the vulnerabilities? If it's a firmware update versus if it's a Docker container for us to generate an SBOM and so on and so forth. And that is applied in different environments, from like air-gapped environments, in the customer environment, being in the data center or even their cloud, AWS, Azure, and so on, or even using our SaaS product as well. And with that in mind, thank you very much for listening to us. I have one last thing. Offset and Inquest had a great partner, or we have a great partnership still, probably for the past almost 10 years. So we have, at Black Hat, we have a joint event where we have a party for cocktails at the top floor of the Delano. If you want to join us there, we're gonna have, please check the QR code. We're gonna have that party at Black Hat. If you're Black Hat, also please stop by our booth. Happy to see you there. We can meet in person. If you have any follow-up questions as well, happy to get that conversation going as well. So thank you very much for your time. I'll stop with that and we can move to questions, I think.
Thanks so much, George. Now, before we get to today's Q&A, I want to ask everyone to direct their attention to our webinar survey available on the bottom of the presentation window. And again, thanks in advance for filling out the feedback form. Your participation in the survey allows us to better serve you. And now on to the Q&A portion of our event. As a reminder to participate, just type your question into the text box located to the right of the presentation window, or click the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. If we're not able to answer all submitted questions during today's webinar, we'll be sure to share them with our speakers who can reply to you offline. And just by the way, a few of you asked about links to some of the things we were talking about today that our presenters mentioned. We added 2 links to the resources tab. To see them, though, you'll have to refresh your console. So let's get going. This first question comes from Charles, and he asks, If we accept files that are uploaded in the prompt and we only extract the content, why do I need to virus scan the files as well?
I can take that one. So there are a couple of steps, right? At the end of the day, you will accept that file, right? And that file, even though you extract the content, let's say just part of your prompt and augment that prompt and so on, right? You're still going to store that file, not just for audit purposes, but most probably it's going to be made available, maybe even part of your training afterwards and so on, right? And probably you're going to have even potentially like, I don't know, a different data pipeline that's going to go in, pick up that file, execute certain things based on that file, or even have someone that's manually going to validate the claims in that file and so on, right? So there is a lot more that you're not just going to throw away that one overnight. And also it's still part of your best practices, the way you accept any kind of data coming from the outside, right? Are you willing to more or less, I know, blindly accept any potential malicious file, even though you extract the content? In general, malicious PDFs don't have valid content, right? They have some basic things to incite you to do something, right? But at the end of the day, it's not going to be that relevant. But in the same time, you still need to go through like a process for you to be able to make sure that everything that is part of your application and push it as much as possible towards the edge, right? Like you want to validate the content before it actually reaches your backend and it's augmenting your LLM. So for me, it's just a matter of like best practice of accepting files from coming from the outside. And there are risks associated with that. It's not just about that. Anyway, you're going to consume the content, right? Just because you don't have an LLM, you're still going to consume the content in an automated or manual process after all. So you still need to have that best practice put in place.
Okay, Darren, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to say my impressions are very similar to that as well, right? I think you make a policy and you adhere to that policy. If that policy is that you're, checking inputs and scanning any sort of file and content is thus a file, I think that makes a lot of sense. One of the things that we sort of watch out for is when the threat is not separate from the content, but the threat is actually embedded in the content. And phishing is a good example of that, right? If I have a way of smuggling files into your environment and you extract content and then forward those either into a database where they're later rendered to a user or somehow messaged to a user, for example, social engineering messages can still be embedded in content. And even in cases where the adversary is not using like an embedded link, for example, or other file-based content, sometimes adversaries recognize these workflows and they just basically put directions into content. And those directions could be things like, copy this text into your browser, copy this text into a command prompt. And social engineering, I think, can be very deadly in that way. And so scanning those things enables you to use analytic engines that kind of match on like semantic content and look for like combinations of words that we know are like easily tied to security, social engineering threats.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks for that. Keep the questions coming. We will get to as many of them in the time that we have remaining. This one comes from Lloyd, who asks, we already use AWS native capabilities for DLP. How would MetaDefender differentiate from that?
That's a sensitive one since AWS is it's a good partner, a great one actually for us. So I'm not sure how much I should kind of like throw them under the bus. I'm kidding. But there are a couple of things, right? At the end of the day, I think AWS is doing a fantastic job offering native capabilities to their platform for various things, right? Maybe like a good example, as I mentioned in the past, like you still need a web part of your application, right? AWS offers the web, but one of their biggest partners is still F5 that's offering one of the best webs in the market, right? So you need to understand, again, based on your use case, on what exact capabilities you need, and potentially not all of them are going to be supplied by AWS, right? So I gave the example, maybe an easy one of redaction, right? We can offer redaction as part of our DLP story. AWS doesn't, right? If you want, feel free to reach out to us. We can go in a more depth conversation, like what we can provide, maybe to augment what you're currently using AWS or not necessarily to replace it. But again, depends on the use case and how you want to apply that information as well, and part of your file analysis story. I can't hear you, Michael. I think you're muted.
I'm muted. Keith, thanks for that answer. Keep the questions coming. We'll get to as many in the little time we have remaining. We have time for perhaps a couple more. And also, ones we don't have time for, we will give to our presenters. This one comes from Nella, who says, I saw that you have CrowdStrike as one of your AVs. Was your product also affected by the faulty update that, for example, still has Delta Airlines in stitches?
Another sensitive topic. So again, we have a great partnership with CrowdStrike. We're using actually their Falcon SDK. We don't use their full Falcon endpoint product, and maybe that's something I should clarify part of our multi-scanning slide, that we OEM this vendor, so we have direct relationship. We license their static detection capabilities, right? We don't install all those products to run on the same machine, right? That would be very hard to achieve since all of them can compete on real-time protection. But like I said, we're not using the full Falcon engine, so we were not affected by that one. That being said, again, we have a great partnership with them. I know a lot of people there, great people, and I feel bad for what happened to them and so on. One thing I want to say that what I highly appreciate, with some small exceptions, let's say the entire anti-malware community kind of like really up and like were very supportive of what happened, and they were trying to like figure out what we can do best as a community, not just to go after CrowdStrike customers overnight and so on, right? Mm-hmm. So I appreciate all the efforts they put together to restore those customers. We do have some joint customers as well that have been affected by the incident. And in general, again, we're working very closely with all our customers and our partners. If there's anything needed from them, they feel free to reach out to us as well if we can help.
I think we have time for one more. This one comes from Evan, who asks, how efficient is AV scanning for open source libraries and containers?
I'm not going to provide numbers per each of the brands, right? Because we're not necessarily in that business, but they got a lot better. So maybe one thing to say is that in general, this was something that not all anti-malware vendors were focused on. And that's something they started adding up a lot more, right? So we work very closely. We're running our own internal tests. We're trying to like scan as fast as possible, and it's being published on the public sources and so on. And we're seeing some vendors are missing their detection on some of these libraries as well. We do have a program where we share those informations with our anti-malware partners for them to go and improve their detection. Now, that being said, in general, it's always going to be a combination of things, right? We shouldn't rely just on one technology to rule them all, more or less, right? That's why there's no such thing as just like, I have endpoint security, so I'm covered for everything security-wise. Same thing here, where we do have all those SDKs, but at the same time, we're providing different ways to augment the detection as well, right? And we have different capabilities part of our Defender platform. Happy to discuss in more details. Feel free to reach out to us and we can explain how that works as well. But in general, what I'm trying to say is that the AV detection for open source and containers is definitely getting better. But again, we're always kind of like a cat and mouse game in the anti-malware industry anyway, to a certain level. So that's why we need to combine certain things to get the best detection possible.
Absolutely. And with that, 60 minutes flew by. That's all the time we have for questions today. I want to thank you, Darren Spruill and George Fikich. Dark Reading, appreciate your time and expertise on today's topic. And also thanks to our sponsor, OPSWAT, as well as to everyone in the audience. We appreciate your attention and participation. Within the next 24 hours, you'll receive a personalized follow-up email with details and a link to today's presentation on demand. Please feel free to invite your colleagues and peers who may not have been able to listen to the event. This webinar is copyright 2024 by Informa. The presentation materials are owned by or copyrighted by Dark Reading and OPSWAT, and the individual speakers are solely responsible for their content and their opinions. On behalf of our guests from OPSWAT, I'm Michael Krieger. Thanks for your time. Have a great day.
Thanks all.